One violet letter was all it took to stir memories of an old mystery and draw Miss Marple into a new one. In the quiet village of Little Biddington, a postmistress vanishes. Secrets bloom among the violets, and ink hides more than words. Will Miss Marple untangle the truth before twilight falls? Welcome to Warm Pages. I'm your host, Hurry. As you listen, tell me in the comments, when was the last time you received a letter that changed everything? Let's begin. Chapter 1. A Curious Correspondence. It was a particularly fine spring morning in St. Mary Mead, the kind of morning that made Miss Jane Marple feel rather pleased with the world in general and her garden in particular. The delphiniums were coming along nicely, and if the weather held, her roses would be spectacular this year. Miss Marple, a slight elderly lady with snow-white hair and china blue eyes that often appeared vague but in reality missed very little, was kneeling by her herbaceous border, a basket of gardening tools beside her, when the gentle clip of the garden gate announced a visitor. "Good morning, Miss Marple," called Mrs. Knight, her part-time housekeeper, waving a small bundle of envelopes. "I've brought the post round early. Thought you might like to see it before I start on the dusting." Miss Marple sat back on her heels and removed her gardening gloves. "How very kind of you, Mrs. Knight. I was just about to come in for a cup of tea. Would you care to join me?" Mrs. Knight beamed. "That would be lovely, miss. I'll just pop the kettle on, shall I?" 10 minutes later, seated comfortably in her chintz-covered armchair by the window, Miss Marple began to sort through her correspondence. There were the usual items: a circular from the local garden centre, a note from the vicar's wife about the upcoming church fete, a bill from the drapers in the high street. But it was the last envelope that caught her attention. The paper was of good quality, and the address was written in the distinctive violet ink that immediately brought to mind her old friend Elspeth McGillicuddy. Miss Marple opened it with the silver letter knife that had been a gift from her nephew Raymond many Christmases ago. "Dear Jane," the letter began, in Elspeth's familiar, rather spiky handwriting. "I do hope this finds you well and that your garden is flourishing. Mine has been quite a trial this year, though the dahlias are coming along splendidly. You really must come and see them when they're at their best. The most peculiar thing has been happening in our little village. You know how one notices these things when one has lived in a place for some time. It's the post office in Little Biddington. Miss Hargreaves, such a reliable soul, been running it for 20 years at least, has been acting most strangely of late. Quite distressed, I would say. And there's talk in the village about letters going missing. Not just any letters, mind you, but specifically ones written in violet ink. Mrs. Ellsworth was most put out when her niece claimed never to have received her birthday card. Violet ink, you see. Mrs. Ellsworth always uses it, says it's more elegant. And then young Tommy Perkins didn't get his examination results, which his tutor had sent in a letter written with violet ink as well. I wouldn't trouble you with such village nonsense, but it reminded me of something you once told me about that business in St. Mary Mead some years ago. The missing correspondence that led to the discovery of that dreadful embezzlement at the council offices. Do you remember? In any case, if you find yourself at a loose end and fancy a change of scenery, you know you always have a bed here. The guest room is aired and ready, and I would be so pleased to see you. We could take tea at the Bluebird Cafe. They do a marvelous Victoria sponge now, and you could advise me on my gardening troubles. The east bed is giving me no end of worry. Your affectionate friend, Elspeth." Miss Marple folded the letter thoughtfully and placed it back in its envelope. Elspeth was not one for flights of fancy or idle gossip. If she thought something was amiss in Little Biddington, then it very likely was. The case Elspeth had referred to had been quite instructive. A series of missing letters had eventually led to the discovery that the council treasurer had been systematically misappropriating funds. The connection had seemed tenuous at first, but as Miss Marple had observed to Inspector Slack at the time, human nature was remarkably consistent. People who were dishonest in small ways were often dishonest in larger ones as well. Miss Marple sipped her tea and gazed out at her garden. It was coming along so nicely, and there was so much to do here in St. Mary Mead. The Women's Institute was holding its annual competition next week, and she had promised to help arrange the flowers for the church on Sunday. But Elspeth was one of her oldest friends, and if she was troubled, Miss Marple came to a decision. She would go to Little Biddington. After all, she had been meaning to see Elspeth's prized dahlias, and a change of scenery would be pleasant. If there was nothing untoward happening at the post office, it would simply be a nice visit with an old friend. And if there was something amiss, well, Miss Marple had found over the years that there was a surprising amount of wickedness in village life. Not that it surprised her anymore. As she often remarked, when you had lived as long as she had in a small village, you had seen human nature in all its aspects. Nothing much could astonish her now. Miss Marple rang for Mrs. Knight and asked her to pack a small suitcase. She would take the afternoon train to Little Biddington. The journey was uneventful, the train only moderately crowded. Miss Marple occupied herself with her knitting, a pink baby's jacket for her grandniece's expected arrival, and her thoughts. By the time the train pulled into the small station at Little Biddington, she had nearly completed the left front panel and had worked out several possible explanations for the curious case of the missing violet letters. Elspeth was waiting on the platform, a tall, angular woman with iron-grey hair pulled back in a neat bun. They greeted each other warmly. "Jane, how wonderful to see you. You're looking very well. The country air must agree with you." "And you too, Elspeth. Those dahlias you mentioned must be keeping you busy." Elspeth's face clouded slightly. "Yes, well, there's been rather more excitement than dahlias lately, I'm afraid. I'll tell you all about it once we're home." They walked through the village, a charming collection of stone cottages and small shops arranged around a central green. Miss Marple noticed the post office, a small brick building with bright red pillar boxes outside. An elderly woman was just emerging, clutching several parcels. "Is that Miss Hargreaves?" Miss Marple inquired. "No, that's Mrs. Wilcox, the baker's widow. The post office should be open for another hour yet. Miss Hargreaves is most particular about her hours." As they passed the building, Miss Marple observed that the blinds were partially drawn, and there was a decidedly unwelcoming air about the place. A small woman in a navy cardigan was visible behind the counter, her head bent over what appeared to be account books. "That's her," Elspeth whispered. "Miss Hargreaves. Notice how tense she looks. She's not been herself for weeks now." Miss Marple noted the woman's pinched expression and the nervous way she glanced up at the door when a young man entered. There was definitely an air of strain about her that seemed out of place in the otherwise peaceful village. By the time they reached Elspeth's cottage, a pretty thatched dwelling set back from the road with an impressive garden, Miss Marple was convinced that something peculiar was indeed happening in Little Biddington. The atmosphere in the village had an undercurrent of tension that reminded her of St. Mary Mead just before the Sanderson embezzlement case had broken. "Now," said Elspeth, as she poured tea in her cozy sitting room, "let me tell you exactly what's been happening. I didn't want to put too much in a letter, but I think you'll agree it's all very odd indeed." Miss Marple settled back in her chair, prepared to listen carefully. In her experience, the most insignificant details often prove to be the most telling. Chapter 2. The Missing Postmistress. The following morning dawned with a thin mist shrouding the cottages of Little Biddington, giving the village an ethereal quality that Miss Marple found quite atmospheric. She had slept well in Elspeth's comfortable guest room, despite the intriguing puzzle presented by the missing violet letters. After a substantial breakfast of fresh eggs and homemade marmalade, she was eager to take a closer look at the post office and its nervous proprietress. "I thought we might walk into the village," Miss Marple suggested to her friend. "I'd like to post a card to my nephew, Raymond. He does worry if he doesn't hear from me when I'm away." Elspeth readily agreed, and the two elderly ladies set off down the lane, Miss Marple carrying her handbag and a small parcel she had prepared for the occasion, a pretext for conversation with Miss Hargreaves. As they approached the village green, however, it became apparent that something was amiss. A small crowd had gathered outside the post office, and the door remained firmly shut despite the hour being well past the usual opening time. "How strange," remarked Elspeth. "Miss Hargreaves is never late. In 20 years, I don't believe she's opened a minute after 9 o'clock. As they drew closer, Miss Marple observed a village constable, a young man with rosy cheeks and an earnest expression, attempting to peer through the windows of the post office. "What's happening, P.C. Barker?" called Elspeth to the constable. The young man turned, touching his helmet respectfully. "Good morning, Miss McGillicuddy. Bit of a situation, I'm afraid. Miss Hargreaves hasn't opened up, and Mrs. Fleming was expecting an important package from her daughter in London." "Perhaps she's unwell," suggested Miss Marple mildly. "That's what we thought, Mom," replied P.C. Barker. "I've knocked repeatedly, and there's no answer from her flat above the shop either." "Have you tried telephoning her?" asked Elspeth. "No answer there either. I've just sent young Tommy to fetch the spare key from the parish council office. As postmistress, she's required to lodge a spare for emergencies." The crowd parted as a breathless boy of about 12 arrived, clutching a large brass key. P.C. Barker took it, and, with an air of official gravity that Miss Marple found somewhat reminiscent of a young actor in his first significant role, approached the door. "I'm going to enter the premises to check on Miss Hargreaves's welfare," he announced to the assembled villagers. "Please stand back." The key turned smoothly in the lock, and P.C. Barker disappeared inside, closing the door firmly behind him. The crowd waited in tense silence, broken only by the occasional murmured speculation. Miss Marple noticed that several individuals appeared particularly concerned. An elderly gentleman with a military bearing, whom Elspeth identified in a whisper as Colonel Fortescue, and a thin, nervous-looking man in spectacles hovering at the edge of the gathering. After what seemed an interminable wait, but was in reality only a few minutes, P.C. Barker emerged, his youthful face now grave. "Miss Hargreaves isn't on the premises," he announced. "The post office appears undisturbed, but there's no sign of her." A murmur ran through the crowd. Miss Hargreaves, it seemed, was a fixture in the village, as reliable and permanent as the church clock. Her absence was unprecedented. "I've telephoned Inspector Craddock at county headquarters," continued P.C. Barker. "He'll be here shortly. In the meantime, I must ask everyone to go about their business. The post office will remain closed until further notice." The crowd dispersed slowly, reluctantly, like a theatre audience after a particularly gripping first act. Miss Marple, however, lingered, her sharp blue eyes taking in every detail of the scene. "Elspeth, dear," she said quietly, "do you think P.C. Barker would allow us to take a look inside? As concerned neighbors, of course." Elspeth looked doubtful. "He's very keen on procedure, Jane. His father was a superintendent in Bristol, you know. Perhaps if you mentioned that Miss Hargreaves is a close acquaintance, I'd be so interested to see if there are any clues to her whereabouts." Elspeth, recognizing the familiar gleam in her friend's eye, approached the young constable. After a brief conversation, during which Miss Marple heard Elspeth emphasize her long friendship with the missing postmistress, P.C. Barker reluctantly agreed to let them enter. "But please don't touch anything, ladies," he cautioned. "Inspector Craddock won't be pleased if the scene is disturbed." The interior of the post office was meticulously tidy, everything in its place. The counter was polished, the scales for weighing parcels precise and gleaming. Behind the counter, Miss Marple could see the small office area where postal business was sorted and organized. "May we see her living quarters?" asked Miss Marple gently. "Sometimes the most ordinary things can be revealing." P.C. Barker hesitated, then nodded. "This way, please, through the back and up the stairs." The flat above the post office was small but comfortable. A sitting room with well-worn furniture faced the village green, and a tiny kitchen looked out over a small, neat garden at the rear. Everything was in perfect order, except for one striking incongruity: a half-drunk cup of tea on the small table beside an armchair, and a pair of reading glasses perched on an open book. "It appears she left in a hurry," Miss Marple observed, her eyes scanning the room. "Leaving her tea and removing her reading glasses. That suggests an interruption, doesn't it? Something unexpected that required her immediate attention." Before P.C. Barker could respond, Miss Marple had moved to the wastebasket beside the writing desk. Among the usual detritus, a couple of circulars, a used envelope, a receipt from the grocer's, was a torn piece of violet-colored paper. "How interesting," murmured Miss Marple. Without touching the basket, she bent down to examine the fragment more closely. It appeared to be part of an envelope, the distinctive color immediately recognizable as the same shade used by Elspeth's correspondent. Moving to the telephone on a small table by the window, Miss Marple noted a smudge of what appeared to be violet ink on the receiver, and beside the telephone, propped open as if recently consulted, was a gardening catalogue, the page displaying various varieties of violets. "Has anyone checked the garden shed?" Miss Marple inquired, straightening up. P.C. Barker looked startled. "The garden shed? No, ma'am. Do you think—" "I think it would be worth looking at everything," Miss Marple replied mildly. "When a person as reliable as Miss Hargreaves disappears, every detail matters." The sound of a car pulling up outside interrupted their conversation. Through the window, Miss Marple observed a tall, distinguished-looking man in a well-cut suit alighting from a police vehicle. "That'll be Inspector Craddock," said P.C. Barker, with evident relief. "If you ladies would please come downstairs, I'm sure he'll want to speak with you." Inspector Craddock, it transpired, was already acquainted with Miss Marple, having consulted her, somewhat reluctantly at first, on a case in St. Mary Mead some years previously. "Miss Marple," he said, with a mixture of surprise and resignation, "I might have known you'd be involved somehow. You have an uncanny knack for being where trouble brews." "Oh, I'm just visiting my dear friend Elspeth," replied Miss Marple innocently. "Such a coincidence about poor Miss Hargreaves. Have you any theories, Inspector?" Craddock surveyed the post office, his experienced eyes taking in the scene. "Too early for theories, Miss Marple, but facts are always useful. Miss Hargreaves was last seen by Mrs. Davis, who lives next door, at approximately 8:30 last evening. She was taking her usual evening walk toward the river. She hadn't returned by the time Mrs. Davis retired at 10 o'clock, but that wasn't unusual. Miss Hargreaves often enjoyed the evening air. And no sign of forced entry or disturbance, mused Miss Marple. "None whatsoever," confirmed Craddock, "which suggests she either left voluntarily or knew her visitor." The unspoken implication hung in the air. Craddock cleared his throat. "P.C. Barker will continue inquiries in the village. If anyone has seen Miss Hargreaves since last evening, we need to know immediately." As they left the post office, the village was alive with speculation. Miss Marple, her keen ears attuned to the nuances of village gossip after decades in St. Mary Mead, detected three main theories emerging. Miss Hargreaves had absconded with postal funds, unlikely given her impeccable record. She had suffered an accident during her evening walk, possible though the river path was well maintained. Or something more sinister had occurred, a prospect that sent a ripple of delicious horror through the village. "People do love a mystery," observed Elspeth, as they made their way back to her cottage. "Though I can't believe poor Miss Hargreaves would simply run off. She's lived in Little Biddington all her life." "Did you know," said Miss Marple thoughtfully, "that she had been seen arguing with Colonel Fortescue recently, about a letter he claimed never arrived?" Elspeth looked surprised. "No, I hadn't heard that. How did you discover it?" "Mrs. Phillips at the edge of the crowd. She mentioned it to Mrs. Burton, who seemed quite scandalized. I just happened to overhear." Miss Marple smiled innocently, but her mind was working rapidly, connecting the violet letters, the missing postmistress, and the distinguished colonel who had looked so concerned in the village square. In her experience, respectable people often had the most to hide, and village life, while appearing tranquil on the surface, frequently concealed currents of passion, greed, and deception that could, under the right circumstances, lead to the most desperate of acts. As they reached Elspeth's garden gate, Miss Marple paused, looking back toward the village. "I think, dear," she said gently, "that we should take a closer look at Miss Hargreaves's garden this afternoon. I've always found that gardens can tell one so much about their owners, don't you agree?" Elspeth nodded, recognizing the determined glint in her friend's eye. Miss Marple had scented a mystery, and like a seasoned hound on a familiar trail, She would not rest until she had followed it to its conclusion. Chapter 3. Secrets in the Garden Shed. After a light luncheon of cucumber sandwiches and Earl Grey tea, Miss Marple suggested to Elspeth that they might take a stroll past Miss Hargreaves's cottage. "I've always heard that her violets are particularly fine," she remarked innocently, "and one does pick up so many gardening tips from observing other people's methods." Elspeth, who had known Jane Marple for over 40 years, recognized that the seemingly casual suggestion concealed a more purposeful intent. Nevertheless, she readily agreed, and the two ladies set off toward the eastern end of the village, where Miss Hargreaves's modest cottage stood with its small but well-tended garden. Yellow police tape marked the entrance to the cottage itself, but the garden gate remained accessible. Miss Marple approached it with an air of mild interest that belied her sharp observation. "Such lovely violets," she commented, examining the neat beds that bordered the garden path. She clearly had quite a gift with them. Not easy to grow so abundantly, you know. They require just the right balance of shade and moisture. Elspeth nodded, glancing nervously toward the cottage windows as if expecting P.C. Barker to appear and accuse them of trespassing. But the cottage remained silent and empty, its windows blank like unseeing eyes. "Jane," Elspeth whispered urgently, "do you really think we should be here? Inspector Craddock might not approve." "Oh, we're merely admiring the garden," replied Miss Marple serenely, "as any neighbor might do. And look, there's something rather interesting." She pointed discreetly toward a small path that led around the side of the cottage to where a modest garden shed stood beneath the shadow of an old apple tree. What had caught Miss Marple's attention were several footprints in the soft earth leading to the shed. Prints that were distinctly larger than one might expect from the diminutive Miss Hargreaves. "Someone with quite substantial feet has been visiting the shed recently," she observed. "A man, I should think, wearing heavy shoes. See how deeply they've pressed into the soil. Quite a large individual, I imagine." Elspeth looked alarmed. "Do you think we should tell Inspector Craddock?" "Perhaps," said Miss Marple thoughtfully. "But first, I think we might just take a little look at the shed ourselves. After all, it's only a garden shed." With a sprightliness that belied her advanced years, Miss Marple made her way along the narrow path, careful not to disturb the footprints. Elspeth followed reluctantly, her natural caution warring with curiosity. The shed door was secured with a simple hasp, but to Miss Marple's surprise, it was not locked. She pushed it open gently, and the two ladies peered into the dim interior. At first glance, it appeared to be an entirely ordinary garden shed. Tools hung neatly on wall hooks. A spade, a fork, secateurs, and a watering can stood in one corner. Flower pots of various sizes were stacked on shelves, along with packets of seeds and small bags of fertilizer. A potting bench ran along one wall, its surface clean and orderly. "She was very methodical," commented Miss Marple, stepping inside. "Everything in its place, quite admirable." But as her eyes adjusted to the dimness, she noticed something unusual about the potting bench. One section of it appeared to be hinged like a drop-leaf table. "How curious," she murmured, approaching it. "I wonder what purpose that serves." With careful fingers, she lifted the hinged section. It rose smoothly, revealing a cavity beneath, and in that cavity lay a stack of letters, their envelopes a distinctive violet color. "Oh," gasped Elspeth, "the missing violet letters." Miss Marple extracted the bundle carefully, using her handkerchief to avoid leaving fingerprints. The letters had all been opened, she noted, and then resealed rather clumsily. "Let's see what we have here," she said, examining the addresses. "They're all addressed to different people in the village, but they all bear the same return address, a Mrs. Veronica Langley from an address in Switzerland." "Veronica Langley," echoed Elspeth. "That name sounds familiar, but I can't quite place it." "Let's see what the letters contain," suggested Miss Marple, carefully opening the most recent one, dated just a week earlier. The letter was written on cream paper of excellent quality, the violet ink flowing in elegant script. "My dearest V." I continue to reflect on the matter we discussed in your previous letter. The truth that must remain hidden weighs heavily upon me, especially as F becomes increasingly difficult. His demands grow more unreasonable, and I fear for what might happen should circumstances become desperate. The documents you requested are enclosed in the usual manner. Please confirm their receipt as soon as possible. With deepest affection, C. Miss Marple frowned thoughtfully. Rather cryptic, wouldn't you say? And who might F be, I wonder? Colonel Fortescue, perhaps, suggested Elspeth. He's the most prominent F in the village. And C could be his late wife, Cecilia, mused Miss Marple. Though she died about a year ago, didn't she? These letters appear more recent. The daughter is also called Cecilia, Elspeth pointed out, named after her mother, though she's been away at school most of the time, I believe. As they examined another letter with similarly veiled references, they were startled by a sound at the shed door. Looking up, they found themselves confronting a thin, nervous-looking man with spectacles, the same individual Miss Marple had observed hovering at the edge of the crowd earlier that morning. "Oh," he exclaimed, clearly as surprised to see them as they were to see him. I beg your pardon. I was just looking for Mittens, the Colonel's cat. She sometimes wanders into gardens." "How curious that you should look in a closed shed," remarked Miss Marple mildly. "Most cats prefer the open air, in my experience." The man, whom Elspeth had quietly identified to Miss Marple as Mr. Wilkins, Colonel Fortescue's secretary, flushed slightly. "Yes, well, Mittens is rather an unusual cat, very fond of enclosed spaces. The Colonel is quite concerned about her. She's been missing since yesterday." His eyes darted to the letters in Miss Marple's hand, widening slightly behind his spectacles. "What have you found there?" he asked, his voice sharper now. "Some letters that appear to have gone astray," replied Miss Marple calmly. "Addressed to various villagers, but never delivered. We were just about to take them to Inspector Craddock. Perhaps you'd care to accompany us, Mr. Wilkins." But Mr. Wilkins was already backing away. No, I must continue looking for Mittens. The Colonel will be most displeased if I return without her. Good day, ladies." He turned and hurried away, his gait awkward and hasty. "Well," said Elspeth, "that was rather peculiar. Do you think he was really looking for a cat?" "I think," said Miss Marple thoughtfully, "that Mr. Wilkins was looking for exactly what we found, and I think we should indeed take these letters to Inspector Craddock without delay." As Elspeth gathered the letters together, Miss Marple's sharp eyes caught a gleam of something under the potting bench. Kneeling down, despite the protest of her aging knees, she discovered a fountain pen that had rolled into a corner. It was an expensive model, with a gold nib and cap, quite incongruous in the humble garden shed. "How very interesting," she murmured, using her handkerchief to pick it up. A Mont Blanc fountain pen, filled with violet ink. Not the sort of thing one would expect to find in Miss Hargreaves's possession. Her means were quite modest, I understand. They secured the shed and made their way directly to the village police station, where they found Inspector Craddock interviewing the elderly Mrs. Davis about her last sighting of Miss Hargreaves. "Ah, Miss Marple," he said, with a resigned expression that suggested he had expected her to appear with the evidence. "I gather you've been conducting inquiries of your own." "Not at all, Inspector," replied Miss Marple innocently. "Elspeth and I were merely admiring poor Miss Hargreaves's violets. Such lovely specimens, but we did happen to notice something unusual in her garden shed." She produced the letters and the fountain pen, explaining where they had been found and their encounter with Mr. Wilkins. Craddock examined the evidence with growing interest. "Letters in violet ink," he mused, "just like the ones reported missing. And all from this Mrs. Langley in Switzerland to various villagers, yet found hidden in Miss Hargreaves's shed. Most irregular." He read through several of the letters, his frown deepening. Very cryptic content, references to the matter we discussed, and the truth that must remain hidden. And these initials, F and C and V, could be significant. A constable entered with a file, which he handed to Craddock. The inspector scanned it quickly, his expression grave. "We've checked Miss Hargreaves's financial records," he informed them. "Most interesting reading. She maintained a modest current account at the village branch of the National Provincial Bank, with regular deposits from the post office for her salary. But over the past year, there have been additional deposits, small but regular, from an unknown source." "Blackmail?" suggested Miss Marple quietly. Craddock looked at her sharply. "That's a serious allegation, Miss Marple." "Oh, I'm not alleging anything, Inspector," she replied mildly, "merely considering possibilities. If Miss Hargreaves discovered these letters and recognized their importance, whatever that might be, she might have seen an opportunity to supplement her rather meager income. And if the person being blackmailed decided the payments had become too burdensome." Craddock left the sentence unfinished, but the implication was clear. "I think," said Miss Marple, rising to her feet with a decisive air, "that we should perhaps pay a call on Colonel Fortescue." His secretary seemed most interested in Miss Hargreaves's garden shed, and the colonel himself was notably concerned at the post office this morning. Craddock looked as if he might object, then sighed in resignation. "I was planning to interview the colonel this afternoon in any case. If you ladies would care to accompany me, in an unofficial capacity, of course. I might benefit from your observations. The colonel can be somewhat formidable." "How kind of you, Inspector," said Miss Marple, with a smile that suggested she had expected nothing less. "We should be delighted to assist in any way we can." As they left the police station, Elspeth whispered to her friend, "Jane, do you really think the colonel might be involved in Miss Hargreaves's disappearance?" "I think," replied Miss Marple thoughtfully, "that in my experience, people with power and position often believe themselves above the ordinary rules that govern society, and when such people feel threatened, they can become quite dangerous indeed." She glanced at the bundle of violet letters now in Inspector Craddock's possession. "Those letters contain a secret, Elspeth. A secret someone was willing to pay to keep hidden, and now, it seems, perhaps even to kill for." Chapter 4. Tea with the Colonel. Colonel Fortescue's residence, Biddington Hall, stood on a gentle rise just outside the village, a handsome Georgian edifice with neatly trimmed lawns and an air of dignified prosperity. As Inspector Craddock's car crunched up the gravel drive, Miss Marple observed the immaculate gardens with their geometric precision. "Such perfect symmetry," she remarked to Elspeth. "Military precision in the hedges. One can always tell a garden tended by someone with a military background." Inspector Craddock gave her a sidelong glance, his expression suggesting that he found her preoccupation with gardens rather irrelevant to the matter at hand. But Miss Marple merely smiled and continued her observation of the grounds, noting particularly a gardener who was working in a distant corner, digging what appeared to be a new flower bed. The front door was opened by a stiff-backed butler who regarded the police car with barely concealed disapproval. "Inspector Craddock to see Colonel Fortescue," announced the inspector, presenting his identification. "These ladies are assisting with inquiries." The butler's eyebrows rose fractionally, but he merely inclined his head and showed them into a spacious drawing room decorated in a style that suggested it had not been updated since the late Mrs. Fortescue's time. Heavy velvet curtains framed the windows, and ornate furniture upholstered in faded silk was arranged in formal groupings throughout the room. "The colonel will be with you shortly," intoned the butler. "He is concluding a telephone call." Left alone, Miss Marple took the opportunity to examine the room more closely. On a side table stood several silver-framed photographs. A younger Colonel Fortescue in uniform, the late Mrs. Fortescue, a handsome woman with a somewhat austere expression, and a girl who bore a striking resemblance to her, presumably the daughter, Cecilia. Miss Marple also noted a writing desk by the window, its polished surface gleaming in the afternoon light. "A very well-kept home," she observed quietly to Elspeth, "though perhaps a little behind the times in its decor." The door opened, and Colonel Fortescue entered with the brisk, no-nonsense air of a man accustomed to command. He was tall, with iron-grey hair and a military bearing, his back ramrod straight despite his advanced years. "Inspector Craddock," he acknowledged, with a curt nod. "And ladies." Miss McGillicuddy, isn't it? We've met at the church fete, I believe. And your companion is? Miss Jane Marple, supplied Elspeth. My dear friend from St. Mary Mead. She's visiting for a few days. Indeed. The Colonel's gaze swept over Miss Marple, taking in her neat, old-fashioned appearance with apparent dismissal. Well, please be seated. I understand you're here about the missing postmistress. Most irregular business. Not the sort of thing one expects in Little Biddington. They seated themselves, with Inspector Craddock taking a position where he could observe the Colonel's face clearly. We're conducting inquiries throughout the village, sir, he began. I understand you were among those present when Miss Hargreaves's absence was discovered this morning. Yes, replied the Colonel impatiently. I had a registered letter I was expecting from my solicitors in London. Important papers regarding the estate. When the post office failed to open, naturally I was concerned. And your relationship with Miss Hargreaves was, prompted Craddock. Purely that of resident and postmistress, said the Colonel firmly. I've known her for years, of course. One knows everyone in a village of this size. But we were not socially acquainted. Miss Marple, who had been examining the display of ornamental paperweights on a nearby table, turned with a mild expression. I understand there was some disagreement recently about a letter you were expecting, Colonel, she said gently. Something that didn't arrive as anticipated. Colonel Fortescue's head swiveled toward her, his expression sharpening. Who told you that? Village gossip, replied Miss Marple vaguely. One hears things, you know, even as a visitor. The Colonel's jaw tightened momentarily before he controlled his expression. A minor matter. A letter from my son's school that contained his term report. Miss Hargreaves claimed it had been delivered, but it never reached me. Probably a simple mix-up with the post. Craddock steered the conversation back to the matter at hand. When did you last see Miss Hargreaves, Colonel? Yesterday afternoon, I believe. I dropped into the post office to inquire about a parcel. Nothing unusual about her manner, as far as I could tell. And your movements last evening? Craddock's tone was carefully neutral. The Colonel's eyes narrowed. Am I to understand that I am under suspicion, Inspector? Standard question, sir. We're asking everyone in the village. I was at home all evening, replied the Colonel stiffly, dining with my daughter, Cecilia, who is home from school, and my sister, Augusta. After dinner, I worked on estate matters in my study until about 11, then retired. Can anyone verify your presence in the study during those hours? Asked Craddock. My secretary, Wilkins, was with me until about 9:30. After that, I was alone. The servants would have retired. At that moment, the door opened, and a young woman entered, slender, with the same austere beauty as the woman in the photograph, but with a nervous tension about her that suggested a tightly wound spring. Father, she began, then stopped short at the sight of the visitors. Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't realize you had company. These people are from the police, Cecilia, said the Colonel, with a trace of irritation. About Miss Hargreaves's disappearance. You remember Miss McGillicuddy, and this is her friend Miss Marple, and Inspector Craddock. How do you do, said Cecilia Fortescue, with a brittle smile that didn't reach her eyes. Such a shock about Miss Hargreaves. She's always been such a fixture in the village. Miss Fortescue, acknowledged Craddock. Perhaps you could help us. Did you notice anything unusual about Miss Hargreaves recently? Any change in her behavior? Cecilia shook her head. I've been away at school most of the year. Only returned for the Easter holidays a few weeks ago. I've barely seen her, except to collect a package or two. But you dined with your father last night, persisted Craddock. Yes, with father and Aunt Augusta, a quiet family dinner. Miss Marple, who had been observing the Colonel's desk, spoke up again in her gentle voice. What lovely violets in that vase, Miss Fortescue. From your own garden. The question seemed innocent enough, but Cecilia's reaction was startling. She dropped the teacup she had just picked up, the fine bone china shattering on the polished floor. I'm so sorry, she exclaimed, flustered. How clumsy of me. I'll ring for Simpson to clean it up. Allow me, said Miss Marple, rising to help. As she knelt to gather the larger pieces, she glanced up at Cecilia. "The violets?" "Oh, yes, from our garden," replied Cecilia, her composure somewhat recovered. "They grow near the west wall." Miss Marple nodded, her attention seemingly absorbed by the task of collecting the broken china. But she had noticed something else during those moments, a violet ink stain on the blotter of Colonel Fortescue's desk, which he had hastily covered with some papers when her gaze moved in that direction. The butler appeared to clean up the mess, and fresh tea was ordered. The conversation moved to more general topics, with Colonel Fortescue making it clear that he considered Miss Hargreaves's disappearance regrettable, but hardly a matter for protracted investigation. "Probably taken it into her head to visit a relative without informing anyone," he suggested. "Or perhaps she's had some sort of breakdown. Running a village post office may seem simple enough, but there's considerable responsibility involved. Not everyone is equipped to handle such pressure indefinitely." Miss Marple, who had resumed her seat, nodded sympathetically. "So true, Colonel. And of course, if one has discovered something troubling, something perhaps one wasn't meant to see, that could add considerably to the strain." There was a fractional pause in the room, a moment of tension like the silence before a thunderclap. Then the door opened again, and Mr. Wilkins entered, carrying a sheaf of papers. "The accounts you requested, Colonel," he began, then stopped abruptly at the sight of the visitors. His gaze flickered to Inspector Craddock, then to Miss Marple and Elspeth, a look of recognition and alarm crossing his features. "Ah, Wilkins," said the Colonel. "These people are inquiring about Miss Hargreaves. You remember meeting Miss McGillicuddy and her friend Miss Marple earlier today, I believe." Wilkins became very still, his thin frame rigid with tension. "Yes, sir," he replied in a colorless voice, while searching for mittens. "Regarding those letters found in Miss Hargreaves's garden shed," said Inspector Craddock, watching Wilkins closely. "Letters written in violet ink, addressed to various villagers but never delivered. Would you happen to know anything about them, Mr. Wilkins?" "Letters?" echoed Wilkins, his voice rising slightly. "No, that is, I was merely looking for the Colonel's cat, as I mentioned." Miss Marple regarded him with gentle interest. "Such an unusual coincidence, your presence at the shed where those letters were hidden. And now here you are, working for Colonel Fortescue, whose late wife always wrote her correspondence in violet ink. A silly affectation, I believe someone called it." "My sister-in-law had somewhat flamboyant tastes," interjected an elderly woman who had entered the room unnoticed during the commotion with the broken teacup. She was tall and angular, with the same aristocratic features as the Colonel, but softened by age. "I am Augusta Fortescue, and you must be the ladies assisting the police. How unusual." "Miss Augusta Fortescue," acknowledged Craddock. "Thank you for joining us. We were just discussing the late Mrs. Fortescue's habit of using violet ink for her correspondence. Cecilia, my sister-in-law, not my niece here, picked up the habit during a stay at a Swiss sanitarium many years ago," explained Miss Fortescue, seating herself with regal dignity. "There was a particular shade of violet ink available there that she became quite enamored with. Insisted on importing it even after her return to England. Most impractical." "Switzerland?" said Miss Marple innocently. "How interesting. The letters we found in Miss Hargreaves' shed were from a Mrs. Veronica Langley with a Swiss address." The teacup in Colonel Fortescue's hand trembled slightly, causing the liquid to slosh over the rim onto the saucer. "I'm not familiar with that name," he said, his voice carefully controlled. "Perhaps a friend of my late wife's that I never met. She maintained many correspondences." "The curious thing," continued Miss Marple, as if she hadn't noticed the Colonel's reaction, "is that these letters were quite recent, dated within the past few months, yet your wife has been deceased for about a year, I understand." The atmosphere in the room had grown palpably tense. Cecilia stared fixedly at her teacup. Mr. Wilkins had gone pale, and Augusta Fortescue's lips had thinned to a tight line. "I believe we've taken enough of your time for now, Colonel," said Inspector Craddock, rising. "Thank you for your cooperation. We may need to speak with you again as our inquiries progress. As they prepared to leave, Miss Marple glanced out of the window toward the violet beds. The gardener she had noticed earlier was still digging, but now she could see that what he was creating was not a flower bed, but something much deeper, a hole of significant depth. Your gardener seems very industrious, Colonel, she remarked. Planting something special in that corner of the garden. The Colonel moved to the window, his expression hardening as he saw what she was referring to. Just some routine landscaping. Jackson often takes it upon himself to make improvements without consulting me first. I shall have to speak to him about it. As Inspector Craddock's car rolled down the driveway, Miss Marple remained silent, her mind turning over the various reactions she had observed during their visit. Well, prompted Craddock, when they were well away from Biddington Hall. I can practically hear the wheels turning, Miss Marple. What did you make of our tea with the Colonel? Several interesting points, she replied thoughtfully. The violet ink stain on the Colonel's blotter, for one thing, and Mr. Wilkins's extreme discomfort at our presence, and that hole being dug in the garden, far too deep for ordinary planting purposes. You think the gardener is burying something? Asked Craddock sharply. Or someone, said Miss Marple quietly. I believe we should examine that area of the garden as soon as possible, Inspector. Tonight, perhaps, when darkness might provide some cover. Craddock looked skeptical, but nodded. I'll arrange it, and in the meantime, I'll have P.C. Barker keep an eye on Biddington Hall. No one leaves without our knowledge. As they approached the village, the church clock struck 5. Miss Marple gazed thoughtfully at the spire rising above the trees. Time has a way of revealing truth, she murmured, almost to herself. Secrets rarely stay buried forever, whether they're written in violet ink or covered with garden soil. Chapter 5. The Violet Ink Revelation. Evening had settled over Little Biddington by the time Miss Marple and Elspeth returned to the latter's cottage. A light spring rain had begun to fall, pattering gently against the windows as they sat in Elspeth's cozy sitting room, discussing the events of the day over a restorative cup of tea. I still can't quite believe it, Elspeth was saying. Colonel Fortescue has always been the very pillar of respectability in the village. To think that he might be involved in Miss Hargreaves's disappearance, it's simply extraordinary. People are often not what they seem, replied Miss Marple, her nimble fingers busy with her knitting. I remember a case in St. Mary Mead. The organist at the church, a Mr. Danby, so respectable, played the most beautiful Bach preludes, and all the while he was systematically stealing from the church restoration fund. When it was discovered, everyone was shocked, but I had my suspicions from the moment I noticed he wore handmade shoes that cost at least 20 guineas a pair, far beyond the means of a church organist. Her reminiscence was interrupted by a sharp knock at the front door. Elspeth rose to answer it, returning moments later with Inspector Craddock, his mackintosh glistening with raindrops. I hope I'm not intruding, ladies, he said, removing his hat. But there have been some developments I thought you should know about. Not at all, Inspector, replied Elspeth warmly. Do sit down, I'll fetch another cup. When they were all seated with steaming cups of tea, Craddock continued, We've been making inquiries about this Mrs. Veronica Langley mentioned in the letters. There's no record of such a person at the Swiss address given. The property exists, a small chalet near Interlaken, but it's registered to a British corporation, Fortescue Holdings. The Colonel's company? Asked Miss Marple. Exactly, confirmed Craddock. And here's another interesting point. We found Miss Hargreaves's walking stick this afternoon, by the river path about a mile from the village. There were signs of a struggle in the mud nearby. Miss Marple's expression grew grave. I feared as much. Did you arrange to investigate the area in the Colonel's garden where that gardener was digging? Planned for later tonight, said Craddock. I've got 2 men watching the house discreetly. If anyone goes near that spot, we'll know about it. There's something else that's been troubling me, said Miss Marple thoughtfully. When we returned to Elspeth's cottage after our visit to the Colonel, I had the distinct impression that someone had been here in our absence. Elspeth looked startled, but nothing was missing, Jane. I checked my valuables. Not to steal, my dear, explained Miss Marple gently. To search. Notice how your cushions are arranged slightly differently than how you usually place them. And your desk drawer is not quite fully closed, though I know how particular you are about such things. Elspeth's eyes widened as she glanced around her sitting room with new awareness. You're right. And my knitting basket has been moved. I always keep it to the left of my chair, but it's on the right now. I took the liberty of checking my room, continued Miss Marple. The violet letters that we found in Miss Hargreaves's shed, the ones I kept as samples, have been taken. Craddock looked alarmed. You should have turned all evidence over to the police, Miss Marple. Oh, I did give you the majority of them, Inspector, she assured him. I merely retained one or two for further examination. There was something about the ink that struck me as peculiar. Rising from her chair with surprising agility, Miss Marple went to her knitting bag and extracted a small envelope. Fortunately, I always keep important items in my knitting bag, which I take everywhere with me. Our mysterious visitor overlooked this. From the envelope she withdrew a sheet of cream paper covered in violet script. This is a sample of the violet letter, but observe what happens when I hold it near the heat. She approached the fireplace and held the letter carefully above the flames, not close enough to burn, but near enough for the warmth to reach the paper. As they watched, the violet writing began to fade until it disappeared entirely. Good heavens, exclaimed Elspeth. The writing's vanished. Heat-sensitive ink, explained Miss Marple. A clever device for secret communication. But even more interesting is what happens when the paper cools again. They watched in fascination as, gradually, the original violet writing reappeared. But now, between the lines of the innocuous social correspondence, a second message became visible. This one in a deeper purple shade. A message between the lines, breathed Craddock. Invisible until the paper is first heated and then cooled. Exactly, said Miss Marple. And this hidden message is far more revealing than the surface correspondence. Craddock took the paper carefully and read aloud. The ledger is in the usual place. F has been transferring funds again. Larger amounts this time. The village restoration account is nearly empty. We must act soon before questions are asked. Embezzlement, said Miss Marple quietly. Just as I suspected, Colonel Fortescue has been misappropriating funds from the village restoration account, which he oversees as chairman of the parish council. But who is this letter really from? Asked Elspeth. And who is V? I believe, said Miss Marple, that the late Mrs. Fortescue was corresponding with her sister, possibly named Veronica or Victoria, about her husband's financial improprieties. The Swiss address was a blind, a way to communicate secretly without the Colonel's knowledge. And Miss Hargreaves discovered these letters, continued Craddock, following the logic. Perhaps one was damaged in transit, revealing the hidden message. Being an intelligent woman, she experimented and discovered the secret, and then used that knowledge to blackmail the Colonel, concluded Miss Marple. Those regular deposits into her bank account, they were blackmail payments. Craddock's expression hardened. If that's true, it gives the Colonel a very strong motive for wanting Miss Hargreaves silenced permanently. The telephone rang, startling them all. Elspeth went to answer it, returning moments later with a troubled expression. That was P.C. Barker, she reported. He says there's been activity at Biddington Hall. A car left about 20 minutes ago, with Mr. Wilkins driving. He appeared to be in a great hurry. Did Barker follow him? Asked Craddock. Sound of footsteps coming from the direction of the house. Craddock quickly doused the lantern, and they retreated behind the substantial cover of a large rhododendron bush. The footsteps belonged to Mr. Wilkins, who had apparently returned to Biddington Hall. He was carrying a spade and moving with purpose toward the covered hole. Just as he began to remove the tarpaulin, another figure emerged from the shadows. Inspector Craddock. That's far enough, Mr. Wilkins, he said firmly, his revolver trained on the secretary. Wilkins froze, then slowly straightened, the spade still clutched in his hands. You don't understand, he said, his voice shaking. I had nothing to do with this. It was the Colonel. All the Colonel's idea. Put down the spade, Mr. Wilkins, instructed Craddock. Then we'll discuss exactly who did what. For a moment, it seemed Wilkins would comply. Then, with a sudden movement of desperation, he swung the spade toward Craddock. The inspector dodged, but in doing so lost his footing on the wet grass. He went down heavily, his revolver flying from his hand. Wilkins raised the spade again, his intention clearly murderous, when another figure burst from the rhododendrons. Miss Marple, her walking stick raised. With surprising strength for one of her advanced years, she brought it down sharply on Wilkins's wrist. The secretary cried out in pain, dropping the spade. In the confusion, Craddock regained his feet and his weapon. "Don't move, Wilkins," he commanded. "You're only making things worse for yourself." With Wilkins subdued and handcuffed, they turned their attention to what lay beneath the tarpaulin. As Craddock pulled it back, their worst fears were confirmed. In the shallow grave lay the body of Miss Hargreaves, her face peaceful in death, her small frame curled as if in sleep. Clutched in her hand was a bundle of violet-colored papers, the missing letters. "Poor woman," murmured Miss Marple. "She must have threatened to expose the Colonel's embezzlement. Perhaps her demands increased, or she became frightened and wanted to end the arrangement." "It was Wilkins who killed her," said a new voice from the darkness. They turned to see Colonel Fortescue standing a few yards away, his military bearing intact, despite the rain that plastered his hair to his skull. "I knew nothing about it until afterward. He claimed he was protecting me, protecting the family name." "But you knew about the blackmail," said Craddock. "You were paying her to keep quiet about the funds you'd been misappropriating from the village restoration account." The Colonel's shoulders sagged, the facade of authority crumbling at last. "Yes," he admitted. "After my wife died, there were financial difficulties. I borrowed from the restoration fund, intending to replace it. But then there were more demands. Cecilia's school fees, estate taxes. It spiraled out of control." "And the letters?" asked Miss Marple gently. "Between your late wife and her sister." "Veronica," confirmed the Colonel. "My wife's twin sister. They were always close, always confiding in each other. Cecilia discovered them after her mother's death and showed them to me. That's when I found out that my wife had known about the embezzlement for months before she died. She was gathering evidence, planning to confront me. But before she could do so, she passed away," supplied Miss Marple. "Heart failure," said the Colonel. "Natural causes," the doctor said. "But I've wondered since if perhaps the stress of her discovery, her disillusionment with me, might have contributed." "And then Miss Hargreaves began blackmailing you," continued Craddock, "having discovered the secret of the violet ink letters." "Yes, small amounts at first, but increasing over time. Last week she demanded a lump sum. Enough to retire on, she said. I refused. We argued at the post office. And Wilkins decided to solve the problem permanently," concluded Miss Marple. "He told me afterward that he'd taken care of the problem," said the Colonel, his voice hollow. "I didn't ask for details. I didn't want to know. But when I saw him digging in the garden tonight, I realized I couldn't be part of it anymore. That's why I called the police." "You called them?" asked Elspeth, who had remained silent throughout the discovery. "Anonymous tip," confirmed Craddock, "about suspicious activity in the Colonel's garden. That's why I was already planning to investigate tonight." "I may be a thief," said the Colonel quietly, "but I draw the line at murder, and whatever punishment comes my way, I deserve it." As they made their way back toward the house, Miss Marple glanced back at the pathetic figure of Miss Hargreaves being lifted gently from her makeshift grave. "In my experience," she said softly to Elspeth, "it's rarely the crime itself that destroys people, but the attempt to conceal it. One lie leads to another, and another, until the weight becomes unbearable." Behind them, the violet beds swayed gently in the rain, their delicate blooms a stark contrast to the grim scene of human frailty and fatal error that had unfolded in their shadow. Chapter 6. Justice at Twilight. A week had passed since the grim discovery in Colonel Fortescue's garden. Spring sunshine had returned to Little Biddington. bathing the village green in the warm glow that belied the somber mood of its inhabitants. Miss Marple sat with Elspeth on a bench outside the village hall, where an extraordinary meeting of the parish council had just concluded. The villagers were emerging in small groups, their expressions a mixture of shock, indignation, and that particular satisfaction that comes from seeing one's darkest suspicions confirmed. "Such a distressing business," remarked Mrs. Wilcox, the baker's widow, pausing beside their bench. "Who would have thought it of the Colonel? And poor Miss Hargreaves, to think she'd been lying there all that time while we were wondering where she'd gone." "Indeed," murmured Miss Marple. "Most distressing." "They say Mr. Wilkins has confessed to everything," continued Mrs. Wilcox, clearly reluctant to end the conversation and its delicious topic. "Is it true that he acted alone, Miss McGillicuddy? You and your friend were there when they found poor Miss Hargreaves, weren't you?" "The matter is in the hands of the police now," replied Elspeth diplomatically. "I'm sure all will be revealed at the proper time." With a slightly disappointed nod, Mrs. Wilcox moved on, joining a group of ladies who were dissecting the meeting's revelations with evident relish. "It will take the village some time to recover from this scandal," observed Elspeth, watching the animated discussion. "Colonel Fortescue was so respected, so looked up to." "People are remarkably resilient," said Miss Marple. "I remember when our vicar in St. Mary Mead was discovered to have a secret wife in Eastbourne, whom he visited once a month under the pretext of attending ecclesiastical conferences. The scandal was enormous at the time, but within 6 months it was hardly mentioned. Human nature tends to absorb these shocks and then move forward." Inspector Craddock approached their bench, looking weary but satisfied. He had spent the past week piecing together the complex case, interrogating witnesses, and preparing charges. "Well, ladies," he said, seating himself beside them, "it's nearly wrapped up. Wilkins has made a full confession. The forensic evidence confirms his account, his fingerprints on the murder weapon, a stone paperweight from the Colonel's study that matches the wound on Miss Hargreaves's head." "And the Colonel himself?" inquired Miss Marple. "Has admitted to the embezzlement of village funds," replied Craddock. "Nearly £15,000 over the past 3 years. But he maintains he had no knowledge of Wilkins's plan to silence Miss Hargreaves, and the evidence supports this. Wilkins acted on his own initiative, believing he was protecting his employer." "But there's more to it than that, isn't there, Inspector?" suggested Miss Marple gently. "Mr. Wilkins had his own reasons for wanting Miss Hargreaves silenced." Craddock looked at her with grudging admiration. "You don't miss much, do you, Miss Marple?" "Yes. Our investigations have revealed that Wilkins had been systematically stealing from the Colonel for years, small sums from the household accounts, manipulating the books to cover his tracks. Miss Hargreaves had discovered this as well, through keep his embezzlement secret, and Wilkins was paying to conceal his thefts from the Colonel. When Miss Hargreaves increased her demands, Wilkins panicked. He feared that if she exposed him to the Colonel, his whole carefully constructed position would collapse. And so he followed her on her evening walk," said Miss Marple sadly, "carrying the paperweight with murderous intent." "That's his account," agreed Craddock. "He confronted her on the river path, demanded she return all the letters and evidence she'd collected, and when she refused, struck her with the paperweight in a moment of panic. Then he carried her body back to the Colonel's grounds and buried her near the violet beds, a location he considered deeply ironic." "And the connection to Switzerland?" asked Elspeth. "Was Mrs. Fortescue's sister really involved?" "Veronica Fortescue exists, all right," said Craddock. "Though she hasn't used the Langley name in years. That was her maiden name, which she sometimes used for privacy. She's confirmed the correspondence with her sister about the Colonel's financial improprieties. After Cecilia Fortescue, the elder, not the daughter, died, Veronica continued to monitor the situation through a network of friends in the village. She was considering coming forward with what she knew when Miss Hargreaves was killed." The village hall door opened again, and Cecilia Fortescue emerged, looking pale but composed. She noticed the group on the bench and approached them hesitantly. "Miss Marple, Miss McGillicuddy, Inspector," she acknowledged with a slight nod. "I wanted to thank you, all of you, for handling this terrible situation with such discretion, especially regarding my mother's letters. The personal aspects of the correspondence will remain private, Miss Fortescue, Craddock assured her. Only the relevant evidence will be presented at trial. And father, Cecilia's voice faltered slightly. They say he's likely to receive a suspended sentence due to his age and his cooperation. Is that true? The Crown Prosecutor seems inclined to recommend leniency, confirmed Craddock. Your father has agreed to make full restitution of the embezzled funds, plus interest. His military record and previous good standing in the community will be taken into account. Relief washed over Cecilia's face. Thank you for telling me. It's been difficult, learning that my mother knew about father's activities, that she was preparing to confront him before she died. I've wondered if the shock of his confession might have triggered her heart attack. We can never know for certain what might have been, said Miss Marple gently. But I believe your mother was a woman of principle who wanted to help your father find his way back to the right path. That's why she confided in her sister, not to expose him publicly, but to gather the courage and evidence needed for a private reckoning. Cecilia nodded, tears glistening in her eyes. That sounds like mother. She always believed in redemption. She straightened her shoulders, composing herself. I should go. Aunt Augusta is waiting at the solicitor's office. We're arranging to sell some of mother's jewelry to help with the restitution. After she had gone, Craddock rose with a sigh. I should be getting back to headquarters. The paperwork on this case will keep me busy for days. Before you go, Inspector, said Miss Marple, there's one detail that's been troubling me. The violet letters found clutched in Miss Hargreaves's hand when her body was discovered. How did they come to be there? Mr. Wilkins said nothing about leaving letters with the body. Craddock's expression became grave. That's one of the more disturbing aspects of the case. After killing Miss Hargreaves and burying her, Wilkins returned to her cottage to search for any evidence she might have collected. He found the violet letters in a hiding place under a floorboard in her bedroom, but instead of destroying them, he decided to create a false trail. He returned to the grave and placed the letters in her hand, concluded Miss Marple, to make it appear that the Colonel was directly involved in her death. Precisely, said Craddock, a particularly cold-blooded action, indicating premeditation rather than panic. It strengthened the case against him considerably. As Craddock departed, Miss Marple and Elspeth remained on their bench, watching the village life continue around them, altered by recent events, but already beginning to establish a new normality. You know, Jane, said Elspeth after a while, I've been thinking about those violet letters. Such an elaborate system of secret communication, the special ink, the method of revealing hidden messages. It seems almost like something from a novel. Human ingenuity is remarkable when it comes to keeping secrets, replied Miss Marple. And yet, as this case demonstrates, even the most clever concealments eventually come to light. Rather like your method of investigation, observed Elspeth with a smile. Gentle questions, seemingly innocent observations, and then suddenly the truth is revealed. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. I merely observe and compare, my dear. People are really very alike in their essential natures, whether in St. Mary Mead or Little Biddington or London. The patterns of human behavior repeat themselves with remarkable consistency. The following morning found Miss Marple packing her suitcase in preparation for her return to St. Mary Mead. The excitement was over, the mystery solved, and she felt the familiar pull of her own garden and the comforts of her cottage. I do wish you could stay longer, said Elspeth, watching from the doorway. The village will seem so dull without you. I think Little Biddington has had quite enough excitement for the time being, replied Miss Marple with a smile. And my garden will be in a dreadful state if I don't return soon. The spring flowers need so much attention at this time of year. Will you come back in the summer? The roses should be magnificent then. I'd be delighted to, said Miss Marple warmly. And without a murder investigation to distract us, we can properly appreciate your dahlias. As they walked to the station, later that morning, they passed the post office, now reopened under the temporary management of Mrs. Davis, the neighbour who had last seen Miss Hargreaves alive. A notice in the window announced that applications were being accepted for a permanent replacement. Life continues, observed Miss Marple. The post must be delivered, letters must be sent. The rhythm of village life re-establishes itself. Though I doubt anyone in Little Biddington will ever look at violet-coloured stationery in quite the same way again, remarked Elspeth. Miss Marple's train arrived promptly, and after fond farewells and promises of future visits, she settled herself in a compartment with her knitting bag and a copy of the Times. As the train pulled away from the platform, she gazed out at the peaceful countryside rolling past the window. The case of the Vanishing Violet Letters